Hello and welcome to beautiful Thompson, Connecticut. Today, I want to introduce you to someone that's been driving me crazy for just about a year now. This is Jonathan Richardson, a former resident of Thompson that died way back in 1872. Jonathan here has a very strange inscription on his headstone, one that I've been trying to figure out for a long time. The inscription reads, Jonathan Richardson, who never sacrificed his reason at the altar of superstition's God, who never believed that Jonah swallowed the whale. Now, the first part of that is pretty easy to understand, right? Never sacrificed his reason at the altar of superstition's God. I'm sure after reading that, you don't need me to tell you that Richardson was an atheist, right? It's a pretty straightforward line. That second part, though, never believed that Jonah swallowed the whale. Shouldn't that be never believed that the whale swallowed Jonah? Because that's how the story in the Bible goes, isn't it? Even if you've never heard it before, the tale of Jonah and the whale is pretty hard to get mixed up like that. Because it's a simple story, really. A guy named Jonah refuses to do as his God commands, so God sends a big fish, or whale, to swallow Jonah. Jonah is inside the whale's stomach for 3 days before he repents and prays to God, and boom, the whale spits Jonah back out. And that's really about all you got to know. Jonah turns his back on God, and then a whale swallows Jonah. So why does this stone say Jonah swallowed the whale? That is the question that I've been trying to answer for a while now. Clearly, what Richardson is trying to do here is highlight his skepticism by denying one of the Bible's most famous stories. So why would he undermine that point by writing the story backwards like this? What could Jonah swallowed the whale possibly mean? Well, after researching this topic here and there for about a year now, I feel like I've finally got a pretty satisfying answer to that mystery, or at least a guess that I'm feeling pretty good about. So please, sit back, relax, and let me tell you about one of New England's most confusing headstones. So right off the bat, I gotta tell you, probably the biggest reason that this stone here is so confounding is just that there really does not seem to be much info out there on Jonathan Richardson himself. Pretty much every single newspaper article or old book that I found regarding Jonathan was written well after he died, only focused on his headstone, and had basically zero information about his actual life. There are about a bajillion old articles out there pointing out the strange inscription, and pretty much none of them have anything to say about the guy buried beneath the stone. They all just say, hey, here's this weird headstone that makes no sense in Thompson. Isn't that crazy? And that's about it. In fact, I was really only able to find just one article about Jonathan that wasn't primarily just about his headstone. A letter written to the editor of the Boston Investigator, published way back in July of 1863. A letter that was actually written by Jonathan himself. Pretty cool, right? I mean, if you can only find one real source on a guy, then something written by the man himself is just about as good as you can hope for. So, this letter starts by saying, Mr. Editor, please stop my paper, for I have thought some of dying this summer if I can make it out fairly. You see, Jonathan had actually been battling an illness for the last 4 months when he wrote that, and I guess he was thinking about just finally quitting the fight and letting the disease take him, so he thought it might be a good idea to write the paper beforehand and cancel his subscription, because he's not going to need the paper anymore if he's buried under the ground, right? So after that very unique little introduction there, we also get some hard confirmation that Jonathan was very much not a religious man. He says that all summer long, priests have been coming by to try and save him in his final days, but each and every time they end up leaving his house convinced that he will die an old, hardened sinner. Because Jonathan has been a professed infidel since 12 or 14 years of age. He says that he has found infidelity a first-rate belief to live by, and now at 74 years of age, better than any to die by. But Jonathan didn't actually die. He kept on living for another 8 years before finally passing away at the age of 82 and finding rest right here beneath his very strange little headstone. And that is just about all we know about Jonathan Richardson. We were able to confirm that he was for sure an infidel, as he put it, so there's no mistaking the anti-religious intent of his inscription, and that's about all we got. Even his wife can't help us. Matilda Richardson is listed beneath Jonathan on the stone, and as far as I can tell, she is just as much of a ghost as her husband. The only thing that I was able to find regarding Matilda is this article published in a Massachusetts newspaper that is, I guess, kind of supposed to be defending her, I guess. The article says that Matilda was actually a good Christian woman, and so it's very disrespectful that Jonathan would have this blasphemous headstone made to be put over both of their graves, which, I don't know, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Maybe she really was a Christian. It's hard to say with just this one article as a source, especially when the article pretty badly misquotes the actual inscription on the stone and never even says Matilda's name. It just calls her his wife the whole time. But who knows? Maybe Matilda really was a Christian married to an old, hardened sinner. By the way, this one journalist here is far from the only person to get really upset at Jonathan's inscription. I found a ton of articles talking about how people used to sneak into this graveyard and kick over the stone because they didn't approve of its sacrilegious content. Even today, you can still see the old scars on the stone from where it's been vandalized and repaired in the past. But okay, at this point, I think it's pretty clear that we're not going to get any hard answers to our central question, right? Like, we're not going to find some super clear-cut quote from Jonathan explaining exactly what this backwards inscription is supposed to mean. No, what we're going to have to do is fire up the old noggin and think outside the box a bit. So how about we start off with a theory that I'm sure some of you might already be thinking on your own. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe Jonathan actually meant to have the inscription say, "Never believed that the whale swallowed Jonah," and it just got messed up somehow. I mean, that would make sense, right? It's one of the first things I thought of, at least. But when you look closely at all those articles about the headstone that I was talking about earlier, it becomes pretty clear that Jonathan almost definitely meant for the inscription to say exactly what it says today. Mostly because he actually had this stone carved at least 5 years before he died. So there's pretty much no way that with all the press surrounding the stone, that Jonathan just somehow never noticed that the words were wrong for half a decade. Like, either he would have noticed himself, or someone would have pointed out to him, or he just would have read one of the many newspaper articles about the headstone and realized that something was wrong. So almost definitely, this was on purpose. For some reason, Jonathan Richardson meant for this headstone to say, "Jonah swallowed the whale." And that is kind of where I hit a dead end for a long time. Until pretty recently, I finally got the idea that maybe I was just looking in the wrong place. Maybe I shouldn't be trying to research Jonathan Richardson, but instead, I should be looking into the mysterious phrase itself. Maybe the answer is in the words, "Jonah swallowed the whale." And so, I started back in on the research with that ethos in mind, and holy cow, we hit the jackpot on this one. I very quickly learned that "Jonah swallowed the whale" is absolutely not just some nonsense phrase that Jonathan Richardson made up. No, what it actually is a relatively common linguistic artifact that has been completely lost to time today. These words show up way, way, way more than you would think in old articles and books and stuff. So what I want to do now is walk you through a few of the different ways that you might hear or read the term "Jonah swallowed the whale" if you were around back during the 19th century. So let's get going with one of the most common ways that you might hear the phrase, as a joke. Constantly, all throughout the 1800s and into the 1900s, people were cracking jokes that hinged on mixing up the Jonah Bible story. Like, here's a great example from 1886. We got a newspaper transcript here of a sermon where the preacher is telling a story. The preacher says that a few days ago, an infidel walked up to him and said, "Hey, how can you possibly believe that a whale swallowed Jonah? That's just impossible." And the preacher replied by saying, "Well, of course I believe that a whale swallowed Jonah. That is 10,000 times more realistic than your side. You atheists must believe that Jonah swallowed the whale." As far as I can tell, this was actually a pretty common little joke that preachers used to sneak into their sermons. Like, here's another example from 1893. Basically, the exact same setup and exact same punchline here. And here's another breed of joke that I came across more than a few times. This one is almost like a prank. You just walk up to somebody and very quickly say, "Hey, do you believe that Jonah swallowed the whale?" And then they're gonna go, "Why, yes, of course I do. I'm a staunchly religious man and I believe every single thing the Bible says." And then you go, "Ha, I gotcha. You thought that I said, do you believe that the whale swallowed Jonah? But I actually said, do you believe that Jonah swallowed the whale? And that is impossible. Gotcha." That little prank was actually common enough that you can even find it in some new-ish books and stuff. So the joke had some real staying power. So much staying power, in fact, that I even found a few almost like counter jokes to this particular prank. Like, if someone walks up to you and says, "Do you believe that Jonah swallowed the whale?" then you're supposed to respond by saying, "Well, when I get to heaven, I'll ask Jonah himself." And then they're like, "Oh yeah? Well, suppose that Jonah isn't in heaven." And then you go, "Well, I guess then you'll have to ask him because you're going to hell. And if Jonah isn't in heaven, then he'll be in hell where you're going to go." Another relatively common use of the "Jonah swallowed the whale" phrase that I came across was basically just as a way to make fun of and criticize religious people. Like, here's a great example from 1849. We got a series of letters and essays here called "The Difficulties of Christianity," in which the author is pointing out all the problems that he has with religion and the Bible. At one point, he's trying to criticize religious folk for having too much trust in the church, and he basically says, "These people believe that the whale swallowed Jonah, but they're so brainwashed that they would just as well believe that Jonah swallowed the whale if their pastor told them to." And here is another very similar usage of the phrase, this time from 1843 in a book titled "A Few Hundred Bible Contradictions." The author's intent with this book was to prove that God, as depicted in the Bible, is a ferocious murderer and wholesale destroyer of men, women, and children. So it's really no surprise that he is again using the Jonah phrase to criticize religious people. It's basically the exact same intention here as the last book. Now, you want to hear the real kicker? The basic point that these two guys are trying to make is essentially these people are so blindly faithful that if the Bible said that Jonah swallowed the whale, they would believe it. Which is kind of funny, because I actually found an unbelievable amount of people saying exactly that, except in earnest, all throughout the 1800s and into the 1900s. Like, far and away, the most frequent way that I saw people using the phrase "Jonah swallowed the whale" was as a method to express how much faith they had in the Bible. Like, check this out. Here's a preacher delivering a sermon in 1892 in Staunton, Virginia. "I believe everything in the Bible. I believe that the whale swallowed Jonah, and I would have believed that Jonah swallowed the whale if the Bible had said so." And here's a story of a preacher saying basically the exact same thing in 1848. "The Bible says that the whale swallowed Jonah, and therefore I believe it. And had the Bible said that Jonah swallowed the whale, I would have believed that also." Like, I could literally stand here all day and read these examples to you. Like, here's 1891, same exact thing, and here's a magazine using the term from all the way back in 1807. Here's an example from Scotland in 1869, so the usage even crossed the Atlantic at one point, and sometimes people would like add a little extra flavor to the phrase, like in this quote from 1869. Faith cares not a straw whether Jonah swallowed the whale or the whale swallowed Jonah. There are no impossibilities with God. And finally, my last example, here's one of my very favorites. A guy in 1891 saying that if the Bible had said so, he would believe that Jonah swallowed several whales with oyster crackers on the side. Like, I cannot stress enough just the sheer amount of sources that I found where people were basically saying this exact same thing almost word for word. Like, I really get the feeling from reading through all this stuff that Jonah swallowed the whale was at least somewhat of a well-known turn of phrase for expressing how much you believed in the Bible. Especially because I actually found a whole bunch of responses to people using the phrase from preachers who disapproved of its message. Like, check this out. Here's the transcript of a sermon that a preacher delivered back in 1837. I'm going to paraphrase here, but basically the preacher says, "You might have heard a good Christian proudly state that they would believe that Jonah swallowed the whale if the Bible said so. But as a religious man myself, I don't really condone that statement. God would have never declared something impossible like that, and we should never act like he might." Here's another example, basically the same story here. This time, a reverend in 1855 is basically saying that he finds the statement kind of silly, that not even a child would feel moved by that kind of declaration. But even that is nothing compared to how harshly this reverend from 1853 condemns people saying the Jonah whale thing. He thinks that saying something like that is no honor to Christianity, and that it's a rash and hasty way to advocate for your religion. Now, whether or not you agree with these preachers is really up to you. The real value for me in these statements is in the fact that they illustrate how common it really must have been for people to be using the Jonah swallowed the whale phrase to express their faith. Like, we've got 3 separate religious figures here, all specifically calling out that kind of statement as something that they do not condone. So it had to be at least somewhat of a pervasive thing to say, right? But hey, if you are still not convinced, then check this out. You know how today you might say something like, "I'm gonna win this tennis match as sure as the sky is blue." Well, back during the 19th century, you just might hear somebody saying, "We're gonna win this card game as sure as Jonah swallowed the whale." Or how about, "My wife is really mean to me. I'd run away to California if I could, but she would track me down and find me as sure as Jonah swallowed the whale." It's kind of strange, huh? Like, I found a few different instances of people using the phrase like this, saying Jonah swallowed the whale as if it's some kind of indisputable fact, just like the sky being blue. My only possible guess for why people would use the phrase in this manner is maybe that it's just like an extension of the "I would believe the Bible even if it said that Jonah swallowed the whale" thing. Like maybe people used to say that so much that it kind of evolved and shortened over time, and "I believe that Jonah swallowed the whale" just became like an in-joke with religious people. And the joke is just that you act like that's a true statement because you would believe it if it was in the Bible. But I don't know, I'm really just guessing with this one. I would love to hear people's opinions in the comments on that particular question. I am really not sure that I got a good answer. One thing I am sure about though, after all we've covered in this video, is that there is no way that this headstone here isn't somehow related to all the Jonah swallowed the whale articles that we've seen, right? Like, Jonathan Richardson had this thing carved in 1867. Right smack dab in the middle of tons of people saying the line about believing that Jonah swallowed the whale if the Bible said so. Like, if that was a common enough saying back in the day that random preachers and pastors felt the need to respond to it, then I think that it is very, very unlikely that Richardson just inexplicably and completely separately thought up that phrase on his own. My best guess is that Jonathan is kind of sarcastically responding to the religious folk that use that phrase by saying, "Oh, you would believe that Jonah swallowed the whale if the Bible said so, huh? Well, I don't have blind faith in religion like you do. I would never believe that. I never fell for the trap of superstition's God, and I would never believe that Jonah swallowed the whale." But of course, if you've got another theory, I would love to hear it, because this is probably one of those history mysteries that will just never have a truly definite answer. So, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.